Whispers began circling the industry. Behind the press releases and runway shows, behind the glossy spreads in fashion magazines and curated interviews, there were murmurs. Steffi Forrester was planning something. No one said it outright. Not yet. But the pattern was clear. Her public appearances grew fewer, her statements more cryptic, and inside Forrester Creations, there were signs of quiet exits. Delegated meetings, postponed campaigns, trusted lieutenants suddenly stepping into the spotlight. And then the announcement came. Steffi was taking a leave of absence. The official line? Family reasons. The real story? Strategic silence. But the silence wasn't withdrawal. It was positioning. Because Steffi wasn't running away, she was preparing for war. Taylor had unraveled. The slap, the lawsuit, the fallout from Ridge's betrayal had left scars no amount of therapy or public support could fully mend. She tried to push through, tried to hold herself upright beside Ridge in Italy, tried to believe the victory in the media meant anything. But it didn't. She could feel the cracks deepening beneath her surface. Even with Ridge gone, even after their separation, the damage lingered. Her presence in LA had become a constant reminder of everything she'd lost, everything she'd been forced to relive. And Steffi saw it. So Steffi made the decision. They would leave Los Angeles. To the outside world, it looked like a mother-daughter healing journey. A chance to reset. They told the press it was about wellness and clarity and mental health. But once they left the city limits, the truth came into focus. This wasn't a retreat. It was a recalibration. And while Taylor underwent a carefully curated series of treatments, therapy sessions, and rest, Steffi was quietly laying out a roadmap, a step-by-step blueprint to shift the power structure of Forrester Creations once and for all. At the heart of that plan was Ridge's growing fall from grace. Since the lawsuit, Ridge had become untethered. His reputation, though formally intact, was quietly questioned in every meeting. Boardroom confidence was shaken. Investors were nervous. His leadership, once unquestioned, was now a subject of scrutiny. Designers whispered about his indecisiveness. The media no longer called him the visionary, but the conflicted heir. And Brooke's re-emergence in philanthropic circles only deepened the divide. Her brand had never looked cleaner. Her presence sharper. And Steffi knew, to reassert control, she would need to dismantle both Brooke's moral high ground and Ridge's position of influence. Not with emotion, not with bitterness, but with data, optics, and precision. She began assembling the plan from abroad. A team of PR consultants, legal advisors, digital strategists. All discreet. All bound by NDA. She collected footage, testimonials, internal documents, anything that pointed to Ridge's pattern of indecision, emotional volatility, and recent legal liabilities. She wasn't out to destroy him. She was out to remove him, gently but firmly, from power. He would remain the face, the symbol. But the control, the decisions, the direction would belong to her. At the same time, she reopened old legal threads. The civil suit Brooke had launched? Steffi's team began a countersuit strategy, not against Brooke personally, but against the narrative she'd spun. They'd accuse her of character assassination, workplace disruption, and attempted brand manipulation. The argument: Brooke's emotional entanglements with Ridge had created a pattern of destabilization within the company, culminating in a lawsuit that cost Forrester millions in image repair. Steffi's attorneys planned to frame it not as revenge, but as corporate accountability. Brooke's behavior, they'd argue, constituted a conflict of interest, one that threatened shareholder trust and investor confidence. But the centerpiece of the strategy was what Steffi called the pivot. It was a 72-page document detailing Ridge's pattern of personal-professional collapse. It mapped out every scandal, the oscillation between Brooke and Taylor, the moments of compromised leadership, the public missteps, the press scandals, and most importantly, the way he had allowed personal bias to affect critical company decisions. It included expert psychological profiles, brand analysis reports, and confidential HR assessments. It wasn't just a document, it was an indictment. And it wouldn't be leaked. No, Steffi's move was smarter than that. She planned to introduce it quietly at the next board review. With Ridge's term as creative lead due for evaluation, she would present the pivot report not as an attack, but as a call for restructuring. She wouldn't ask the board to fire him. She'd ask them to reassign him. Create a new honorary role. Remove his decision-making authority. Offer him a dignified out. Meanwhile, she would position herself as the stabilizing force the company needed. Young, respected, globally admired, and most crucially, untouched by the chaos of recent months. But to make the move airtight, she needed one last piece, a final discrediting blow to Brooke. And so, she turned to her most powerful tool, media. With her team, she began drafting a documentary-style exposé to be timed for release just before the next Forrester fiscal review. It would be produced through a neutral third party and framed as a deep dive into legacy fashion brands and the cost of personal conflict. Brooke's history would be central, her decades-long presence at the company, her relationship with Ridge, the implications of her legal threats. But subtly embedded would be Steffi's counternarrative. That the company had been repeatedly compromised not by design failures or market trends, but by a culture of emotional chaos centered around one woman's obsession with staying relevant through proximity to power. Everything would be framed through suggestion, not accusation. But the damage would be irreversible. Taylor didn't know the full extent of the plan. Steffi protected her from it. She let her mother focus on healing, kept her in peace, away from the noise. Taylor asked occasionally how things were going in LA, but Steffi kept her answers vague. "It's under control," she would say. "I'm preparing for something better." And deep down, Taylor suspected there was more to it, but she let it be. She didn't want another war. But if Steffi could restore order, restore herself, then maybe it was worth it. Back in Los Angeles, the board prepared for its annual summit. Ridge was unaware of the roadmap unfolding beneath his feet. He spent more time sketching, avoiding meetings, trying to regain the trust of a company that no longer looked to him. Eric, weaker than ever, remained silent. Donna stayed by his side, quietly monitoring the tremors in the family. Brooke began to sense something, too. Invitations stopped arriving. Editorials that once celebrated her were now focused on Steffi's initiatives. Hope noticed sudden changes in internal budgets, unexplained reassignments. Liam warned her, something's moving. Steffi's not just on break. She's doing something big. Then came the leak, not of documents, but of tone. A fashion blogger posted a cryptic thread suggesting a massive leadership realignment was brewing at Forrester. Mentions of legacy instability and moral leadership vacuum caught fire. The public didn't know who they were about, but Brooke did. She called Ridge. He had no answers. He hadn't heard about any shift. But when he walked into the next executive pre-brief and found his name not listed on the agenda, he realized something had changed. And it was already too late. The board meeting began. Steffi entered quietly, composed. Not as a daughter, not as a co-CEO, but as the next rightful leader. She handed each board member a copy of the pivot report. There was no emotion in her voice as she laid out her proposal. Her arguments were factual, substantiated, professional. She praised Ridge for his decades of creativity and leadership. Then, without flinching, she stated, "It's time we separate personal legacy from corporate leadership." The vote wasn't unanimous. But it was enough. Ridge was reassigned. Effective immediately. And as Steffi stood at the top floor of the Forrester Tower that evening, staring out at the skyline, she made one quiet call to her mother. "It's done," she said. "Come home whenever you're ready." But what Steffi didn't realize, what no one realized, was that Brooke, Watching everything fall into place from the outside wasn't finished either. She had seen too much, survived too long, to let this be the final chapter. And somewhere, quietly, she began preparing her own return. Dr. Grace Buckingham was no stranger to controversy, but nothing in her past could compare to the firestorm heading her way now. Whispers were swirling through the corridors of the hospital, and soon they would explode into headlines. Her miraculous brain tumor surgery on Liam Spencer, a procedure dubbed impossible by most of the medical community, had catapulted her into the spotlight. Bill Spencer, ever the proud father, hailed it as the best $1 million I've ever spent. Liam was alive, awake, and supposedly cured. But behind the polished headlines and press releases, two doctors were beginning to connect the dots. Dr. John Finnegan and Dr. Bridget Forrester weren't buying the miracle. Finn had gone to visit Liam just days after his shocking discharge. At first, he said all the right things: congratulations, relief, ah. But as he watched Liam move, speak, and joke about beating death, something didn't sit right. Not just as a doctor, but as a man who had dedicated his life to neurosurgery. The brain scans, especially the most recent one, didn't match what he'd expect from a patient who had just survived a supposedly inoperable tumor. Finn had seen miracles. This wasn't one. He began to dig deeper. Finn reached out to Bridget Forrester, someone he trusted. Not just for her medical expertise, but for her gut. Bridget had her own reservations about the way Grace had handled Liam's release, especially after the gunshot wound. According to hospital protocol, a patient with a high-risk brain tumor and a recent gun injury should have been under observation, if not in ICU. But Liam had been discharged early, practically pushed out the door, with no clear follow-up, no medication, and barely any documentation. Something was off. Bridget pulled the latest scans, and what she saw shocked her. There was no sign of a tumor. Not even residual scar tissue. The imaging was clean, as if there had never been anything there to begin with. Bridget, meticulous and methodical, triple-checked the records. The original diagnosis came from Grace, backed by a private lab, not the hospital. The surgical report was vague. And most concerning of all, there was no footage, no internal peer reviews, and no published case notes. It was as if the miracle cure had been a ghost story with a 7-figure price tag. Finn and Bridget began their investigation quietly. They didn't go to hospital administration. Not yet. They needed proof. Finn began combing through Grace's past. He knew about her ex-husband, Dr. Reese Buckingham, and the scandal he'd caused with the baby switch that nearly destroyed Hope Logan's life. Finn had always kept his distance from that drama, choosing to believe that Grace wasn't like Reese. But now he wasn't so sure. Was it possible she shared more than a name with her disgraced former partner? Finn's suspicions deepened when he found out that Grace had used her private clinic, not affiliated with the hospital, to perform the surgery. He and Bridget contacted the imaging lab listed in Liam's file, but the address was fake. The phone number went straight to voicemail. They dug further, calling in favors from colleagues, tracing paperwork, subpoenaing financial records discreetly. Then came the breakthrough. Bridget found a bank transaction, exactly $1 million, wired from Spencer Publications to an offshore account in Grace Buckingham's name. Within 24 hours, a second transfer had been made. $980,000 to a second, unidentified recipient. The remaining $20,000? Spent on a new medical device that had never been used in surgery. It was enough. Finn and Bridget confronted Grace. At first, she denied everything. She said the tumor had shrunk unexpectedly, that the surgery was successful, and that the rest was private. But Finn pressed harder. He showed her the scans, the fake lab, the missing records. Grace's facade began to crack. She insisted she had done it to help Liam, to give him peace, to give Bill hope. She said Liam truly believed he was dying, and sometimes that belief was more powerful than any medicine. But it wasn't enough. The truth was simple. She had faked the diagnosis. There had never been a tumor. She had manipulated Bill, staged medical evidence, and taken the money to pay off an old debt, one that tied back to Reese. But the worst revelation hadn't come yet. Finn, digging even deeper, uncovered something Grace had buried. The night Liam was shot, a shooting that nearly killed him hadn't been random. It had been Luna Nozawa, acting in a moment of fear and confusion, who had pulled the trigger. The details were murky. The motive was unclear. But Grace knew. She had been there in the aftermath, and instead of reporting the incident or admitting the truth, she had used it. She had leaned into Liam's amnesia. She had constructed the narrative of the brain tumor to mask the trauma and justify the medical urgency. Then she turned to Bill with the story of his son's ticking clock, and he had handed over the money with no hesitation. Now it was all unraveling. Bridget and Finn took the evidence to Bill. The reaction was nuclear. Bill Spencer, a man who rarely forgave betrayal and never tolerated being made a fool, exploded with fury. Not only had Grace lied, she had made him believe his son was dying. She had manipulated his love, his money, his fear. He promised retribution. He mobilized legal teams, media contacts, private investigators. He didn't just want his money back. He wanted her reputation destroyed. Grace went into hiding. The press caught wind of the scandal fast. Miracle Cure fraud headlined every gossip site, followed by leaked emails, grainy images, and anonymous sources. Grace's license was suspended. Lawsuits began piling up. Bridget and Finn testified before a medical review board. Liam, stunned by the truth, struggled to accept he'd been manipulated so deeply, his sense of self fractured by the idea that his memories, his fear, had been orchestrated. And through it all, Bill Spencer waged war. He made public statements. He gave interviews. He called for reforms in private medical practices. He demanded that the California Medical Board make an example of Grace. And behind the scenes, he ordered quiet retribution. Contacts in real estate, finance, and law slowly erasing any hope Grace had of returning to her former life. But perhaps the most devastating blow wasn't legal. It was personal. Hope Logan, who had once trusted Grace, who had leaned on her during the nightmare with Reese, felt the betrayal cut deepest. She confronted Grace in a private hospital hallway. No cameras. No press. "You took what Reese did," Hope said coldly, "and you made it worse. He stole a child. But you stole peace." Grace couldn't respond. She left Los Angeles shortly after. No press conference. No apology. Just silence. Meanwhile, Finn and Bridget's reputation soared. Their integrity, courage, and medical diligence became the story. Ridge and the Forresters publicly thanked them for protecting the family legacy. Liam slowly recovered and, with therapy, began to rebuild his identity. But the damage lingered. The name Grace Buckingham was now synonymous with betrayal. Bill never recovered the $1 million, but he made sure the world knew what had been done to his son. And as for Grace, wherever she went, whatever name she tried to use next, one truth would follow her. She made everyone believe Liam Spencer was dying for money. And in a town where image was everything, that was a sentence worse than prison.